April 28th, 1865. John Accord has made his way about 50 miles from home to Charleston, West Virginia. A lot had happened over the past 4 years, with John having served in the Confederate Army since 1861 alongside his brothers. Robert E. Lee had surrendered just 4 weeks prior, and there had been uncertainty since then about the path forward for some of the former Confederates. Then Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, dying the next morning and making Andrew Johnson the new president. But now, John was taking advantage of a proclamation Lincoln had made just a year and a half prior. An amnesty oath to be pardoned by swearing allegiance to the United States. Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's episode of YouTuber Family Trees, we'll be discussing Max Miller's Confederate ancestry. On the last episode about Max Miller's family, we looked at Max's paternal ancestry and the Miller family's involvement in World War II. We also learned about Max's great-grandfather Arthur Miller, who had died young at the age of 29, and we had learned a bit about Arthur's parents, Harvey Miller and Sarah Ann Accord, focusing mostly on Harvey Miller's origins. But for today's video, we'll be looking at Sarah Ann Accord's ancestry. So now, we're going to talk about the Accord family, which is apparently the family that your father was not the fondest of. So this is your father's paternal grandmother.
Okay. The only thing I ever remember him telling me was he didn't like his father's mother, the grandmother. He said she was a mean old German lady who would kick my toys. That is all I knew about him.
Sarah was born in 1866, the first of 11 children born to John T. Accord and Margaret Bailey. Sarah grew up moving around to various farms with her family throughout Missouri. The family moved around a lot, so it's hard to place specifically how many places they lived over Sarah's childhood. But we know that in 1870, the family lived in Marshall, Missouri. Then by 1878, they were in Joplin, Missouri. Then in Walnut Township, Missouri by 1880. Then back to Marshall, Missouri for a few years before heading to McDonald County by 1884. Sarah Ann Accord would marry Harvey Abraham Miller in 1888 in Missouri, but they would quickly move to Oklahoma before moving back to Missouri sometime between 1891 and 1893. In the meantime, Sarah's parents, John T. Accord and Margaret Bailey, would move with their younger children to just outside Houston, Texas, where they would live the rest of their lives. John and Margaret would make quite the trek across America over their lifetime, with their origins starting in Virginia. Well, at least what used to be Virginia. John and Margaret were both born deep in the Appalachian Mountains, both descending from families who had come to the area in the late 1700s. John being born in Fayette, Virginia in 1842, and Margaret in Baileysville, Virginia in 1843. John was the second youngest child of 5 siblings, with 1 sister and 3 brothers. John's father, Robert, died unexpectedly on November 20th, 1859, when John was only 16. The reason listed for Robert's death is just fever. In 1860, when John and Margaret were just teenagers, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States of America, and soon various southern states started to secede from the Union. Virginians would hold what was known as the Richmond Convention throughout early 1861, eventually leading to Virginia seceding from the Union. Not all Virginians agreed, with many seeing secession as treason, so a separate convention was also held in Wheeling throughout 1861. This led to a secession of the western part of the state of Virginia from the rest of Virginia, then calling themselves the Restored Government of Virginia. By 1863, this area was officially admitted as its own state to the Union, and now known as West Virginia. John and Margaret were living right between Eastern and Western Virginia, but it was very clear where their families' loyalties lay. Well, John was living in Virginia. Can you guess what side he was on? So, John volunteered for the 22nd Virginia Infantry in the Confederacy. So here's a close-up picture of John.
Quite the mustache.
And then we have the muster rolls.
That's a powerful
Wait,
mustache.
that picture, has nothing to do with him going into
That's
the
not
army.
what he looked like.
Yeah, this is the one
they
photo
really
we
were
have.
hard.
This is someone in the time where it's like, we have a photo, we're lucky to have a photo.
Okay.
I thought this was quite interesting, but I didn't really know the history behind it. So I reached out to my friend Chris from Vlogging Through History to help explain it.
So when we look at the Civil War, we often tend to think of the massive armies in the East and in the West. Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, solid lines of gray and blue going toe-to-toe. But for soldiers like Max's ancestor, John T. Acord, and indeed my own ancestors, the war was far more personal, chaotic, and brutal. It was a neighborhood war. John Acord's service record is fascinating because it traces the complete collapse of Confederate Western Virginia. He starts out as a conventional soldier, morphs into a guerrilla fighter, and ends up in exile. So I want to break down his journey into three distinct phases: the battle for the Valley, the Bushwhacker War, and the long road to exile. So first, let's talk about the 22nd Virginia Infantry. John enlisted in the regiment right at the start of the war on July 3rd, 1861, and he didn't go alone. He enlisted alongside his older brother Joseph and several cousins. At the time, this unit was known as the 1st Kanawha, and it was commanded by none other than George S. Patton, the grandfather of the World War II general of the same name. For John and Joseph, this wasn't about invading foreign soil. This was about defending their home. They were fighting in the Kanawha Valley campaign. Specifically, they fought at the Battle of Scary Creek on July 17th, 1861. This is 4 days before the Battle of Bull Run. And this battle was crucial because it was one of the first Confederate victories of the war. They fought to hold off Union General Jacob Cox and his soldiers from Ohio and Kentucky, and they did it using local knowledge and raw nerve. Even their commander, George Patton, was wounded in the shoulder during the fighting, but the line held. It was a small battle, less than 20 men killed between the two sides, but it was the kind of fight that most men, like John Acord, would experience in the mountains of Western Virginia. But this conventional form of warfare wouldn't last. By the fall of 1861, the Confederates were pushed out of the valley, and the Union took Charleston. For the Acord brothers, this was devastating. They were retreating from their homes, leaving their families behind enemy lines. And this is likely the moment that radicalized men like John Acord. He didn't want to march east to Richmond to fight in a big army. He wanted to stay and fight for his home.
John would continue fighting with the Virginia 22nd Regiment, seeing lots of fighting throughout West Virginia, eventually making their way to Sewell Mountain. Both Union and Confederate troops were camped outside of Sewell Mountain, each gearing up for what they imagined would become a major battle. General Robert E. Lee was brought in to command about 9,000 Confederate troops against around 8,200 Union troops. Amongst these troops were John Acord and the rest of the Virginia 22nd Regiment. But heavy rainfall caused serious issues on both sides, most especially affecting their supply routes. Both sides eventually decided to withdraw, and the major battle that everybody was expecting never happened. In April 1862, the Confederate Congress passed the Partisan Ranger Act, an act which allowed the creation of partisan rangers for unconventional warfare. It gave them the same pay, rations, and quarters as regular soldiers, but also gave them the ability to sell back any arms and munitions captured from the Union. On August 26, 1862, John and his brother Joseph transferred from the 22nd Virginia Regiment to a company within Hounshall's Battalion Cavalry Partisan Rangers under Captain W.D. Thurman, fighting alongside other partisan ranger companies, including another company commanded by W.D. Thurman's brother, Philip J. Thurman. All locals, all fighting for their homes.
This leads us into the next chapter of his service in a unit known as Thurman's Partisan Rangers. On August 26, 1862, John and Joseph transferred out of the regular infantry and into a partisan unit commanded by Captain W.D. Thurman. That very same day, the war truly became a family affair as their oldest brother Eli and youngest brother James enlisted in the Rangers alongside them. Now, these Rangers weren't typical soldiers. They operated under a Confederate law known as the Partisan Ranger Act, which allowed them to function as semi-independent scouts and raiders. They operated in the rugged terrain of the New River Gorge, territory that larger regular armies weren't able to control. This was a war of ambush and bushwhacking. They utilized hidden pathways and ambush points that only locals knew existed. In one famous incident in May 1863, the Rangers ambushed Union cavalry and drove them toward a bridge where Captain Philip Thurman had removed the planking, effectively trapping the Union troops in a kill zone. But it was a brutal existence. They were often operating behind enemy lines, emerging long enough to attack supply lines and communications before disappearing into the hills again. The Union labeled men like the Acords as outlaws, and the discipline was, let's just say, loose. Records show that John and Joseph were eventually listed as deserters when payments stopped in late 1862. It was likely that they had gone back home to check on their families before the war eventually pulled them back in. And this wasn't unusual. Most records that I have investigated over time show incidents of things like this happening.
So this is basically kind of him re-enlisting, but they also say in remarks down here, transferred from the 22nd Virginia Regiment, deserted since muster.
What's that?
So deserted since muster basically means that after this muster roll, he deserted.
I'm done.
Okay,
I'm out.
I might have a white-collar criminal, but you've got a deserter.
Yeah, but he from the Confederates, so he's a hero.
Yeah.
But in the end, the Confederacy realized they couldn't control these partisan groups. And so by 1864, many of the Rangers were consolidated into regular battalions like the 45th Virginia Infantry Battalion in order to take on the last stands of the war. And this final phase took a heavy toll on the Acord family. While John somehow was able to make it through the war without being captured or wounded, his brothers weren't so lucky. His brother Joseph was badly wounded in the side during vicious hand-to-hand fighting at the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain in May of 1864. His youngest brother James was captured late in the war in April of 1865 and sent to the notorious Camp Chase prison in Ohio.
On March 26, 1865, John would marry Margaret Bailey in Wyoming County, West Virginia. A month later, on April 28, 1865, John made his way to Charleston, West Virginia, to the headquarters of the 1st Separate Brigade to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States of America. This oath was something that was made available through a proclamation by Abraham Lincoln way back in 1863, which basically gave amnesty and a pardon to Confederate rebels, and now John was taking advantage of that opportunity. John's brother Joseph Acord even signed his amnesty oath on April 3rd, 6 days before Lee surrendered at Appomattox.
On April 28, 1865, John T. Acord was in Charleston, West Virginia, the very city he had fought to defend 4 years earlier. but he was there to sign his oath of allegiance. This was a bitter pill. By signing it, he wasn't just surrendering, he was regaining his status as a citizen and as a human being in the eyes of the law. Without this oath, he couldn't own property or conduct business. But the oath wasn't even enough. The post-war government enacted test oaths that effectively banned former Confederates from voting or holding office. John T. Acord had become a stranger in his own land. So like thousands of other displaced Southerners, his family went west. But I'll turn things back over to Jarrett to tell you that part of the story.
A month after John signed his amnesty oath, the new American president Andrew Johnson issued his own proclamation for prior Confederates to take an oath of allegiance for amnesty and a pardon, although it was a little stricter than the 1863 proclamation. John's youngest brother James Acord would take this oath under the new proclamation when he was released from Camp Chase on June 13th, 1865. Sometime around May of 1865, Margaret would become pregnant with Max's second great-grandmother, Sarah Ann Acord. But John and Margaret didn't have any plans to stick around West Virginia. They soon moved to Missouri, where Sarah was born. John's youngest brother, James Acord, would follow him to Missouri, while the rest of the Acord siblings would stay back in West Virginia and live there the rest of their lives. John and Margaret would eventually make their way to the greater Houston area in Texas and live the rest of their lives there, with John passing away in 1909. But years after John's death in 1923, Margaret would apply for a widow's pension based on John's service in the Confederacy. And I imagine some of you are wondering, Confederate soldiers were given pensions? This is the application. So it gives, it's her testimony. It also gives the affidavit of the witnesses. And so this is the oath, and this is exactly what she stated to them. Actually, I should read it. I'll have one of you read it.
All right. So my question is, who's paying the
Yeah,
pension?
I
of
was
wondering
that
They know Confederacy.
The state of Texas was actually paying the pension, and this is something that dated back to the 1880s. And Texas wasn't the only state with a Confederate pension, with 14 states having pensions available in some form to Confederate veterans and certain family members such as widows. For Margaret, she appeared before a Judge Chester H. Bryan in Harris County on May 28, 1923. In her affidavit to the court, she says,
I am the widow of John Acord and have been a resident of the state of Texas for the past 26 years. I have made diligent search to locate someone who served with my husband in the Confederate Army, but have been unable to find anyone who served with him. I am unable to furnish proof of my said husband's service by affidavit of anyone who served with him, and wish to avail myself of the provision of Article 6270 of the revised statute of the state of Texas. Nobody wanted to fess up because he deserted.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Did they know?
Margaret would pass away 9 years later in 1932, and I believe she was buried with John in Glenwood Cemetery in Houston, but I say believe because for some reason her side of the gravestone is uncarved. Her death certificate shows that she was buried in Glenwood Cemetery, and the Glenwood Cemetery website lists her as being buried in the same lot number as John. So it seems that she is buried with John, but her gravestone lays uncarved. But what about before John and Margaret? What's their ancestry? Interestingly enough, they actually have a shared ancestry because John and Margaret were first cousins. John's mother, Nancy Gore, was the sister of Margaret's mother, Delilah Gore. And on the next YouTuber Family Trees episode on Max's family, we'll look into the history of the Gore family in Western Virginia.
but he wasn't a redcoat. Because after the Confederacy thing, if you tell me he was a redcoat, I'm out.
No, he wasn't a redcoat. He wasn't a redcoat.
All right.
Something we have to hide.
Yeah, we're going to start hiding all this stuff. It's going to be just a big dark segment in this show.
Quite the opposite. In fact, because of his service, you were eligible for the Sons of the American Revolution, and you were eligible for the Daughters of the American Revolution. Anyone that you can guess that would be famous that's a relative to the Gore family?
Al.
From
And
Tennessee.
you are correct. So not only are you related to him, but technically you're related to him twice.
And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it, be sure to check out this other episode of YouTuber Family Trees right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.